Good evening, welcome to what's happening in John's shed again. Right, just a little follow-on video from what I did before on the CG125 or Honda. This is an aftermarket carburetor, very similar. A little follow-on to what I did, I explained the workings, the basic workings of these carburetors to give you a little bit more understanding. One little part I did omit, it may not affect some people, but it can just help you if you're struggling with an engine that you've modified at all. So if you've altered the characteristics of the engine, for example, made a freer flowing exhaust, or put an aftermarket free flowing filter on there, or both, what can happen is you need to rejet it. I did go through this in the other video as well, but the one bit I didn't cover was with the pilot fuel jet, or pilot air jet, depending on which carburetor you've got, if you refer to the other video. If it's a pilot fuel, we'll stick with that because that's what this is. If you need to adjust your pilot air screw and you find that you are, for example, having to screw your pilot air screw almost right in, I mean, as I said before, if you screw it in till it seats and then turn it back 2 full turns, that gives you a nice datum to start from. Once your engine's warmed and you've been for a little ride, then you can adjust just this and you tick over accordingly. Right, so you've made your mods to your exhaust and your inlet, and you come to set this and you find that that screw is almost out, say 3 turns. I wouldn't like to go much more than 3 turns because it starts losing tension off the little spring that's in here that stops it unscrewing itself. So if you get to 3 turns and you're still having to want to go further out, say 4 turns, then that's telling you that this adjustment is running out of range, because it's only got a small range. There's only like a little tapered seat under here. That little tiny, this is why you don't need to screw them in very tight, because you can snap that little devil off, which I've actually found in the past. So as I say, if you get to the point where you feel as if you need to screw this out even further to get your setting, that's telling you that this pilot fuel jet needs to come up bigger by 1 size. So you, for example, I'll just make a number up here. It's not relevant to anything because I don't think there's any numbers on this, but for example, say this is a 3. If it says 03 on the end or on its circumference, you want to come up by 3 to 3.5 or 4 at the most, and then that will give you a new range on this. So what you would do, you would screw it right in, like I said before, till it's seated, screw it out 2 turns, start your engine, run it up to running temperature, take it for a ride, and then you would start your setting up procedure again, where you adjust this and adjust your tick over accordingly, as I explained in the other video. Now on the other hand, if you find that you're having to screw this screw right in till it's almost seated, or it is seated, and you can't get the setting on that side, it's telling you that this needs to be reduced in size, the hole. So again, if we say this was a 3, you would want to go down to a 2.5 or a 2, and by doing that you give this its range the other way. As I said before, once you start altering carburation on these, not so much on these little engines because they're more of a domestic working engine, but on some more higher strained engines it can make a big difference. So you only have a certain range on that adjustment, and it's exactly the same if the pilot air screw was on this side, going in where that little blanking ball is in there. You would do the same adjustment, screw it into its seat, and then turn it back 2 turns, and then we come back to this. So there is only a certain adjustment range on this. Right, I hope that explains it. I did miss that out last time. Now also, while we're on this subject, if you've got this free flowing exhaust and inlet and whatever you've done, Down the centre of the slide is the metering needle, which is like a brass colour, and it sits under the slide, hangs under the slide, goes into the jet housing here through that brass jet that you can see from the top, hopefully there. So as you open the throttle and it lifts the slide up and it lifts that needle up, that needle has got a taper. Now it's not just a taper, it's a very, very cleverly worked out taper that is there to cope with the changing airflow, demand on the engine, revs, and the amount of fuel it's allowing through. As I said before, as soon as you start messing with these jets and anything other than its factory settings, you can get into a world of pain with getting it right. So you don't want to be messing about unless you really need to. So that needle's taper is very important, because if you've altered the characteristics of the engine and carburation, and you've altered this main jet, as I said before in the other video, you will more than likely need to alter the position of that needle in that slide, because at a certain position in the throttle, that needle is only metering a certain amount of fuel. That controls its maximum amount that it can ever get, and the needle controls it while you're altering the throttle. So if you've altered the characteristics of the engine and it needs more air and more fuel, you also will probably need to alter the position of that needle. Now that's held in position in the slide by a small circlip in a series of grooves around the top of the needle where it sits in the slide. There's like a W-shaped spring clip that holds the whole assembly down, and then the spring, your return spring, sits on all that and keeps it all clamped together. If you lose that little spring, it's a pain in the arse, because nothing else will really do. I've tried all sorts of things in emergency and it is never very successful. So be very careful when you take that out, if you do. Now what I'm coming to is to alter the position of that needle, up or down. If you remove the circlip from the groove it's in, if you move that circlip down one hole, what it is in actual fact doing is lifting the needle higher up. So it pulls it out of there a little further. So it will let more fuel in at the same position as it would have been with the slide. So if the slide had been there, you move the needle so it goes down further, it'll be closing it off. If you lift it up so it comes up further, it'll let more fuel in. So that's an adjustment on the needle. Conversely, if you take the circlip out and move it up a groove, it'll push the needle down further, which will close that hole more in that same given position, if that makes sense. Now this can start to alter the characteristics of an engine quite a lot, as will making a free flow exhaust and inlet. So it all adds up to, this is a very, very clever, even though it looks quite straightforward now I've explained it a bit, it's a very clever device for metering accurately and consistently fuel and air mixture under various loads of the engine. So when you start messing about with your drill and your soldering iron and messing about and taking restrictions out the exhaust and chopping the end off to make it into a megaphone, whatever you're doing, and you put a K&N type free flow air filter on, all that is altering it from what Mr. Honda spent God knows how many thousands developing, because they don't just make this up because I think it's a good idea. They make it up for a good idea and then they test it and test it and test it, and believe you me, they've been doing this for a long time. They've been making these little engines and similar engines for 50 odd years, and they know what they're doing. So when you start messing about with your screwdrivers and your toolkits, and me myself, I'm guilty of it, you can go down a rocky road and you can spend a lot of time and effort and end up with absolutely no gains at all. You might think so, because they always go faster when they sound fast, don't they? And if you can hear a bit of induction roar, well, that's worth 5 miles an hour, and we all know how it all works. So if you're going to go down that rocky road, just be very aware of these things for the metering of the fuel air ratio, because without that being right, the engine's never going to be right. On a 2-stroke, even more so, because if you start getting a lean mixture at high revs, when the top end of the engine's getting very hot, and running a lean mixture tends to make it run hotter, you end up melting holes in pistons. Engines can seize up because they've been getting too hot, pistons distort, cylinder barrels distort, all sorts of problems. And conversely, if you get the mixture too rich, it'll never pick up the revs, it'll start 4-stroking, a thing that used to absolutely do my head in on a 2-stroke. When they start 4-stroking, they sound like a bloody old chainsaw running on diesel. And also it'll start smoking heavily, your fuel consumption will go to shit, as will it on a 4-stroke. You know, if you get it wrong, if you go and whack a great big jet in there and lift your needle right up, it'll just make a bit more noise and drink a lot more petrol and go no faster. And if you're a green person who doesn't want to pollute the atmosphere, the last thing in the world you want to do is making more fumes than necessary, again, especially if you're on a 2-stroke. So there lies another lesson. I hope I've not baffled you too much, or I haven't explained it clearly enough to be explaining something rather than making it more involved. Yeah, so that's my thoughts on it. Probably get argued with people. I did talk the other night about these little tiny valves for cutting the fuel supply off with the floats, and on the end of here, I'll get really close, there's a little tit, and that's spring loaded, look. So when the float comes up and pushes this whole assembly up, well, once that's on its seat, and you can see the line round where it's been seating quite nicely, once that's seated, that pressure on that spring there, I'll hold it on its seat. So it doesn't matter how hard you push that, it'll only let you push as hard as that spring gives. So when the float's in the wrong position, when I was telling you about blowing through the pipe to make sure the airflow stops, just be wary that can only move. If you push it right up onto there hard, you can push it hard, but obviously the float will never do that. And when the float goes down, this little spring makes sure this doesn't stick, because not all of them have these on. And what used to happen, these used to stick, especially if they've been stood for a while, and you used to have to get a screwdriver handle and give the float chamber a tap, which would release it. And the other way around as well, if this didn't seat quite properly and your carburetor started flooding, especially like on the old Amel carbs or on the SU carbs, if they started flooding, because they didn't have these little tips on here, these nitrile tips, they were just a brass taper. You used to get your screwdriver handle and tap the float chamber to make it seat itself, or dislodge if there was a bit of crud in there, dislodge that, and what happens then when that moves off its seat, it allows the fuel to come through and go down these grooves, look, all the way around, so it lets the fuel out. Again, like all the best ideas, it's very simple, and that idea has been used for the last 60, 70, 80 years. Why change something that works? So yeah, that's my another ramble about a little carburetor. Yeah, I hope that's been of some help to you, and if it has, please like and subscribe, and we'll get some more stuff done. And if you've got any ideas or anything that you want me to try and explain to you, if I possibly can, I will do. So like and subscribe, and I'll see you soon. Good night from What's Happening in John's Shed.